Welcome, Steve.
Well, thank you very much. I was really delighted to get Rachel's invitation to this discussion because I do a fair amount of library discussions, and this was a really interesting one. And I've never really spoken about the immigration and of Arab Americans, and especially their lives after 9/11. But it really piqued my interest too. So tonight, I'd like to talk about two things, and I'm going to spend a little less time on the first, but a lot more time on the second. The first is a history of Arab immigration to the United States. And the first phase of that really begins about 1880. There had been individual Arabs who had come to the United States earlier than that, but 1880 is a time when they really start to come in larger numbers. Between 1880 and 1924, approximately 95,000 came from the area known as Greater Syria, which in those days encompassed the modern nations of Syria, Jordan, Israel, and Lebanon. Economic conditions drove them here largely, especially the large number of Lebanese who came here. It seemed there was a blight on the mulberry tree in Lebanon, and the silk industry, which had been flourishing in Lebanon, collapsed. Another factor was poverty. Parents or farmers would divide their estates among their children, and at a certain point, nobody had enough land to really make a living. So young people took off for the United States. There are a lot of stories about this. There was a couple of brothers, for example, who were sent to Beirut to get a package of Jordan almonds for a wedding. And instead of going to Beirut, they hopped a ship and came to the United States and ended up in Danbury. So this is the kind of thing, a lot of that happened. A lot of the initial immigrants were men, but fairly soon they sent for women to be brought over as brides. In 1900, the Ottoman Empire began drafting Christians. And until this time, they had not. They had recruited some Christians for service in a special cavalry unit called the Janissaries, but by and large, they left the Christians alone. And now they started recruiting them into the military and drafting them. So most of the initial immigration from that era between, shall we say, 1880 and 1924 were Christians. Eastern Orthodox Christians, often referred to as Syrian Orthodox. Today they're referred to as Antiochian Orthodox. Maronite Christians from Lebanon, who are a branch, an Eastern Rite branch of the Roman Catholic Church, and Melkite Greek Catholic Christians, who are Eastern Rite, Greek Rite, but are allied with the Roman Catholic Church. And most of the immigrants from Lebanon were of these groups. There were smaller groups of Muslims and Druze, which is a sect of Islam, although Muslims don't generally recognize them as Islamic, but most of them were Christians. So what did they do when they came here? Well, a lot of them became grocers and peddlers, especially out in the Midwest, where settlements were sometimes few and far between, and you needed a peddler to go back out on horseback or with a wagon and reach some of these faraway settlements. And the Arabs were especially good at this. You see, the Lebanese especially are descended from the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians dominated Mediterranean trade in ancient times. So the Lebanese always felt that they have entrepreneurial genes. And I'm tempted to agree with them because they never wanted to work in factories or mines or anything like that. They always wanted to be entrepreneurs. Some came here and worked in mines and factories, but those were mostly the Syrians. For example, there is a settlement of Syrians in Lansing, New York, which is up near Ithaca, and they worked in the mines up there. Some Syrians also went to Brooklyn and worked in factories there. But the Lebanese generally became peddlers or small grocers. In Danbury, for example, which has a large Lebanese population, there must have been 20 local groceries owned by Lebanese people about 50 years ago. Now, the Middle Easterners had tried to identify as white. And this was really important because if they identified as colored, they would face a lot of discrimination. So they had to go to court sometimes to get recognized as white people. And in the state of Georgia in 1924, the Lebanese won an appeal of a case in which a George Dow, D-O-W, sought to be declared white, and the Supreme Court of Georgia declared him white. So from that point on, because that decision was persuasive on other states, the Middle Easterners became known as white. Now, in 1924, immigration from the Middle East was virtually choked off. And the reason why was the passage of a law, the Johnson-Reed National Origins Quota Act, 1924. And this act provided that the immigration from all countries would be capped at 150,000, and that any particular region could have only its percentage of the population in 1890, okay, for their immigration quota. So since the Syrians and Lebanese were less than 0.5% of the population in 1890, they were allowed very few immigrants. Italians, for example, were 2% of the population in 1890, so they were allowed 3,000 immigrants a year. But as many as 800,000 immigrants had been coming in 1910, and this was curtailed down to 150,000. This was passed during the presidency of Calvin Coolidge. Now, there were some exceptions made. After World War II, the United States made exception for immigration from on the part of people who were highly skilled, doctors and other kinds of professionals. And this contributed to a brain drain in the Middle East. They also settled the United States refugees coming from the newly formed state of Israel, and about 2,985 families came in the 1950s as refugees. Now, all of this picture changed in 1965. Under Lyndon Johnson, a law was passed called the Hart-Celler Immigration and Nationality Act. And one of the sponsors, of course, was a legendary Emanuel Celler of Brooklyn. This eliminated quotas on all nationalities, and people were to be admitted to the United States based on skills and based on status as students, and based upon relatives that they had here and people who would sponsor them. So after 1965, between 1966 and 1990, over 400,000 Arabs came to the United States. And there was a larger mix of Muslims here mixed in with the Arabs coming to the United States. Most of them were still Christians, but there were many Muslims mixed in as well. A lot of students and professionals came, also refugees from the Lebanese Civil War. There was a terrible civil war between Muslims and Christians between 1975 and 1990. And large numbers of people, mostly Christians, came to the United States to flee the Lebanese Civil War. Now, from 1990 to the present, there's been a larger number of immigrants coming in, mostly due to conflicts within Arab countries themselves. And what we find is that just after the turn of the century, we have the attack on 9/11. And that changed the whole picture of Arab immigration to the United States. The attack was carried out by Saudi nationals. There were 4 planes, 2 that hit the World Trade Center buildings, 1 that hit the Pentagon, and another that hit a field in Pennsylvania, because the passengers on the plane had taken the plane over, and of course, you know how to fly it, but down it went into a field. Now, in the aftermath of that, there was a widespread outburst against Muslims in the United States, but actually this extended to all Arabs as well. Now, President Bush, to his credit, went on television and said, look, this is not to be blamed on Muslims. Muslims here are good citizens, and we shouldn't be blaming them for this type of thing. But that word did not fall on receptive ears in some cases. Donald Trump, for example, reported on TV that thousands and thousands of people were cheering for as the planes hit. They were cheering in Jersey City. Of course, that was a lie, but nonetheless, that got a fair amount of currency at the time. And this inflamed many Americans against the Arabs coming in. Now, even Christians found it very difficult to immigrate to the United States from Arab countries because all Arabs were cast under suspicion. Now, the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee issued reports after those years, and they reported in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, 520 violent incidents against Arab Americans, 6 of which were murders. Now, not all of those incidents were perpetrated against real Arabs or real Muslims. An American Marine sergeant beat up a Greek Orthodox priest in Florida, and he claimed that the priest was saying Allahu Akbar. Now, there isn't a Greek Orthodox priest in the world who would say Allahu Akbar. But for this particular Marine, just the fact that the Greek priest was dressed in a black cassock and a hat, it was justifiable. The attack on him was justifiable just for that. And so, and a number of really ignorant Americans attacked Arabs. They also attacked Hindus and Sikhs as well because of their distinctive dress. So people who had nothing to do with the Muslim religion were targeted just the same. Now, there were numerous reports to the anti-American, Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee of employment discrimination. Companies would you'd go to an interview and you'd say, a company would say to you, well, we hired someone else. We just felt perhaps you wouldn't be a good fit. And that was often the justification for it. There were numerous terminations in companies. And so Arab Americans found their employment picture very difficult. Women who had worn hijabs took them off just to keep their jobs. All right. There was also a lot of profiling in law enforcement as well. Police who were in largely Arab American, especially Muslim neighborhoods like Dearborn, Michigan, some places in California that were heavily Arab, routinely pulled over Arab Americans and subjected them to searches and all sorts of other indignities with no probable cause at all. It reminded me of the time I'd been in Russia in 1945, and some of us were in the back seat driving with a fellow whose wife was a faculty member with us, and he was Armenian, so he was dark. And of course, the cops pulled us over and took him in the car and shook him down for $100 American. And that's the kind of thing that happens in Russia. Dark-skinned people who were habitually profiled. And of course, it happens in the United States, as we well know. This happened to Arab Americans. There was a lot of tension in schools, tension between students, because some students would say, oh, you're Muslim, huh? You're an Arab. You must be a terrorist. Your parents must be terrorists. And of course, you know, kids can be pretty cruel at times. And there was a lot of friction between students. There could also be friction between students and teachers and administrators as well. Some teacher might want to, you know, lighten the atmosphere a little bit and might say, oh, okay, is your family terrorist or something like that? Might laugh it off and try to make a joke, but that would not be well received. Arab parents used to come into the school and complain about that kind of thing, and sometimes they got results, and sometimes they just didn't. The USA Patriot Act was passed in the closing months of 2001. And that gave the federal government broad power to detain non-citizens indefinitely. And it was under this authority that Guantanamo, the Guantanamo camp was set up on a strip of land occupied by the United States in Cuba, and that camp operated for a number of years. There was a presidential directive that enabled the government to try non-citizens accused of terrorism in military courts. The government could also eavesdrop on attorney-client phone calls of non-citizens. None of these acts ever applied to American citizens of Arab ancestry, but non-citizens seem to have their rights somewhat abridged. There was an increased scrutiny of visa applications for young men who desired to come from Arabic-speaking countries. Very often, the State Department used foreign student advisors on university campuses to investigate international students and to report back to the federal government. Now, in June of 2002, the federal government mandated that all men from certain Arab and Muslim countries would report to the government and be fingerprinted. there were no convictions. A couple of Muslim countries like Indonesia and Pakistan were exempted from this, but this applied to primarily Arabic-speaking countries. Police departments in that decade, and for a long time thereafter, were monitoring mosques, recruiting Arabs to go into the mosques and listen to the Friday sermons and report back to the police. They were to report people who attended the mosques. They were to report what the imam said in the sermon. And there was also a lot of surveillance of Arab businesses, such as restaurants, the olive store, and other kinds of establishments run by Arabs. The police department in New York actually set up a youth soccer league and a youth cricket team and recruited young Arabs to play in them so that they could spy on them and their Arab families. This went on from 2002 to 2014. None of the surveillance of mosques or of Arab businesses or the youth soccer and cricket teams, none of that produced a single arrest. Okay. The Council on American Islamic Relations estimate that about 16,000 specifically anti-Muslim bias incidents occurred between 2011 and 2020. And Professor Brian Levin, who is the director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University at San Bernardino, wrote in 2020 that anti-Muslim hate and Arabophobic prejudice has been normalized. Now, let me ask, I'll stop here for a few minutes and let me ask if there are any questions so far. Would anyone like to ask a question? Just put it in the chat and Rachel will bring it forward. I have more to continue, but that was a big bite. So let's ask about questions. Does Guantanamo still exist? Right, so it doesn't have many people in it, but Guantanamo is still an American Marine and naval base. And they have a few detainees, but I'm not sure how many at this point. Almost all of them have been gone.
Going back to that Arab, that long word that I can't quite pronounce, how has it been normalized and what were they doing?
Oh, Arabophobia has been normalized, is what Brian Levin said. And basically, overt acts against Arab Americans had never really been okay in American history since the Arabs started coming here and they were declared white. There were never any riots against Arab Americans, whereas there were riots against Italians, especially one in New Orleans where a number of Italians were killed. There were riots against African Americans all the time throughout the 20th century, but not a single riot against Arabs. Not very, very few incidents of anti-Arab sentiment. Generally, Arabs tried to assimilate very quickly. They seem to have learned English very fast. Some of them abandoned their Eastern Rite Christian religions and became Roman Catholics or Episcopalians especially. And many of them became entrepreneurs and joined the Rotary and the other kinds of clubs you found locally. So they worked hard at assimilation. They may have spoken Arabic in the home, but they certainly worked to assimilate with the regular American population. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't maintained some Arab customs. At St. Anne's Church in Danbury, for example, in the 1940s, after Sunday Mass, the men would go up into the priest's apartment and say in the living room, and the women would go up into the kitchen, and they would all have a hookah and smoke hashish. But that isn't generally done anymore. They used to have hashish that they called the Pride of Lebanon. And that was a kind of a ritual, a benefit of going to Mass on Sunday. But they really tried to assimilate as best they could. Yeah. How about the anti-Japanese sentiment in World War II? The Arabs after 9/11 were never interned in camps the way the Japanese were. I don't think Americans would ever put up with something like that again. But there were plenty of incidents against people who were perceived to be Muslim, you see. So Arab Americans had to be very, very careful. Other questions? Okay, then let's move on. I'd like to talk a little bit about the experience of Mona Amir. She was a graduate student in Toledo, and now she is a professor of clinical and community psychology at the American University of Cairo. And she gave an interview for The Voice of America back in 2021 on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And these are some of the things that she said. She said, "I remember feeling the shock, fear, confusion, and despair of watching the towers crashing to the ground, and the reports of firefighters and police scrambling to save lives." She recalls, "When the news channels started speculating on the Muslim and Arab background of those steering the planes, I started to feel the world closing in on me. I felt separated from everyone else who was watching the news and instantly knew that my life would change after that." She said, "I was studying acculturation and mental health of Arab Americans at the time, and I was advised by my faculty supervisors to temporarily put my research on hold to not attract surveillance of authorities. After I later returned to the research and publicized some of the results in the media, I received horrid emails, including death threats." Now, many of the death threats, of course, against people are not carried out, and the violence is not carried out, but it certainly would give you pause. It would have a chilling effect on anyone who was really studying this subject seriously, or anyone who wanted to publish information about some of these issues. Now, from the American University at Cairo, where she presently is a professor, she has written that Muslims in the United States had higher rates of depression, anxiety, and fear. Arab Americans in the United States reported feeling more sadness, depression, anxiety, a sense of a lack of security, feeling unsafe, but also at the same time, finding sources of resilience and trying to find ways to gain strength from the experience and try to build community around what had happened on 9/11. Arabs reacted, and Muslims reacted in very different ways here, a range of ways. Some of the women simply took off the hijabs and stopped wearing the traditional Islamic dress. Many of the men stopped wearing traditional Islamic dress and instead dressed like your average American worker or businessman or whatever. Now, of course, the Lebanese Christians had never had a distinctive dress, nor had they ever had a head covering. So they just looked like everybody else, only a little bit darker. But the Muslims really had to a large extent, abandon their traditional dress. I had a student at Central Connecticut whose name was Rania. And Rania was a very beautiful young woman who wore a hijab. Otherwise, her vesture was completely American, jeans with a hijab. And she was born in the United States. And we discussed this a little bit. She and her husband had moved up here to the north to actually manage a warehouse. And her husband was managing the warehouse, and he was from Lebanon. And she had grown up in the United States and was an observant Muslim. And she was hired by an accounting firm because she had a bachelor's in accounting. And she wore the hijab. And at one point, I said to her, I said, where did you live before? She said, well, we were in Tennessee. I said, was the treatment that you were accorded in Tennessee with the hijab at all different from how you were treated up here? She said, oh, yes. She said, we were under constant scrutiny down there. We endured a barrage of insults all the time. And when we came up here to Connecticut, it happened very seldom. Very seldom. So she was a very interesting person. Her boss once said to her, why don't you take off that hijab? You look like J-Lo and Jennifer Lopez. And so Rania said to him, I thought you hired me for my accounting skills, not because I look like J-Lo. So apparently they could get along pretty well. But no, she didn't experience kind of the anti-Muslim sentiment that she experienced in Tennessee. There's another person I want to cite, and her name is Rachel Gillum. And she is a professor at the Stanford Institute for Research in the Social Sciences, or Stanford University. And she did a survey of Muslims in post 9/11 America, a survey of attitudes and beliefs and their implications for US national security policy. And she was asked the question, what motivated you to carry out this kind of a study? And she said, I was motivated to carry out this study in light of the post 9/11 security environment, which changed the lives of all Americans, perhaps most dramatically, though, Muslim Americans. We saw restrictions of certain civil liberties in exchange for security, justified by a perceived threat from Muslims. It was clear, however, that there was little empirical evidence about Muslim Americans to examine the premises and assumptions that underlie the policies. Now, her one goal was to offer a better and more accurate picture of the Muslim population in America in order to highlight the gap between the policy premises and the reality. And she said that as it relates to these assumptions underlying our security policies, contrary to the belief of much of the American public, the study demonstrates that Muslim Americans not only reject supporters of political violence at the same rate as Christian Americans, but that Muslim Americans have actually helped defend the United States by serving as one of the largest known sources of information toward disrupting terrorist plots since 9/11. Additionally, far from being an isolated community, Muslims have had economic and social experiences similar to other American communities, with later generations becoming more integrated and identifying as Americans at rates identical to other US-born Americans. So what she tried to emphasize, or at least that her surveys and the data showed, that American Muslims in their attitudes weren't really much different from American Christians. They had similar attitudes toward violence, similar attitudes toward their obligations as citizens, similar attitudes toward helping the United States government, and indeed, many of them served as informers in the Muslim communities to try to keep their ear to the ground and listen to see if there were plots of any sort. She found that US-born Muslims expect the American government to abide by its commitments to fairness, equality, and due process. And when the government doesn't live up to those promises to American citizens, American-born Muslims will call the government to account. Will call to account through letters and congressional action, and of course, lawsuits. However, non-American born Muslims have been far more reluctant to challenge the treatment accorded to them by the American government, because they're not citizens and they felt that they were on thin ice for many, many years. Now, the Muslim community has, she writes here, the Muslim community has been incredibly helpful to law enforcement in the post 9/11 era. There were a number of Muslim American organizations and community leaders reaching out to offer support and feedback to law enforcement. But she did say that unfortunately past and ongoing policies that unfairly target Muslims have damaged the relationship between Muslims and US law enforcement. Many American Muslims suspect that US law enforcement will not treat Muslim criminal suspects fairly. And so sometimes they are reluctant to inform on those in their community who might be under suspicions. Immigrants also noted they were concerned about the possibility that going to law enforcement would bring unwanted scrutiny on themselves and on their immediate families. Learning that negative consequences had accrued to some immigrants after engaging with law enforcement, including non-terror related deportations, that had a chilling effect. And so there was, as much as Muslims were recruited to help the effort on the part of the police and federal authorities to nip terrorism in the bud, some of the actions done by police and federal authorities actually made the Muslims more skittish and more afraid to actually engage in that kind of cooperation or activity. So what can we say? Probably the last, let's say between 2017 and 2021, the verbiage coming out of the White House was very xenophobic and ethnocentric, like the Chinese disease or the Chinese flu or the Chinese COVID, as the president would say. And he also talked about the Muslim danger or the Muslim menace, et cetera, coming out of the White House. The xenophobes had full reign during the Trump administration. And that has all ended with the Biden administration. Derogatory comments about the Chinese flu or something, or danger of Muslims. That has all ended, okay? Obama had put that aside, and now Biden has put that aside. And of course, the initial reaction of President George W. Bush is that the Americans should not blame all Muslims for this attack. So in the last, shall we say, 22 years since 9/11, Arab Americans in general and Muslims in particular, and those people perceived wrongly to be Muslim, have come under attacks, sometimes violent physical attacks, but very often verbal attacks, as a result of 9/11. And it seems that that is beginning to cool down finally, but it's taken 20 years. Now, let me answer whatever questions you might have at this point. Feel free. Do I have a sense of percentage of Arabs who are Muslim? In the United States, it's probably about 40%. Majority of Arabs in the United States are still Christians. The biggest, probably the biggest Arab communities are in Michigan, the area around Dearborn, Michigan. There are a lot of Muslims in that community. And then on the West Coast, there are a number of Arab communities. Many of these are strongly Christian, but Dearborn, Michigan seems to have a larger Muslim component. Now, of course, there are also immigrants from countries like Iraq, which of course is an Arabic-speaking nation. But the people coming from Iraq are by and large Eastern Rite Christians whose native language was Aramaic and not Arabic. But they would come to the United States and generally concentrated in places where there were large Arab American populations already. There's another question, though. Somebody asked a question.
Before we go to that, there's a clarification, and this is exactly why I asked the question. It is my understanding that Muslims are not always Arabs and vice versa. So we want to make sure to clarify that.
Yeah, Muslims. There are a lot of Muslims from North Africa. For example, Moroccans, although they speak Arabic, regard themselves as ethnically different from Arabs, and their names are different. There are lots of Muslims in India, and of course in Pakistan. Pakistan's a very Muslim nation. Afghanistan is too. And these countries, by and large, speak Indo-European languages. In Pakistan, Urdu is an Indo-European language. In Iran, which is by and large a Shiite Muslim country, they speak generally Persian Farsi, and that is also an Indo-European language. It's closer to English than it is to any kind of Arabic. In Indonesia is by and large a Muslim country, as is Singapore. Malaysia is a Muslim country by and large, and of course they are not Arabic at all. There's a tribe of Muslims in China. They're called Uyghurs, Ughurs, Uyghurs, and They speak their own kind of Central Asian Turkic language. They have been under a lot of persecution from the Chinese Communist government. Okay. And there are Chechens, for example, who are still part of the Russian Federation. They are Muslims. Azerbaijan and some other countries in the Caucasus region are Muslim as well. Georgia and they're not Arab, but Georgia and Armenia are both Christian nations. So, in Africa, there are a huge number of Muslims as well. So even though all Muslims are commanded to pray in Arabic, and the Holy Quran is written in Arabic, Muslims are found in over 50 different countries around the world. And there are long, well-established Muslim communities in many of these places.